We are broadcasting, and so I think we're good to go. Good evening, everybody. My name is Reg Hoyt. I'm the co-chair of Animal Biotechnology and Conservation at Delaware Valley University, and I happen to be chair of the One Health Working Group here at DelVal as well. Before we get started with our speaker, I just want to give you a brief introduction to One Health program at DelVal. We're now entering our fifth year. This is our fifth year of doing One Health seminars. I hope that many of you have seen many of the ones in the past and you'll continue to join us. Many of you probably already know about One Health, but just quickly here, One Health is really the recognition that we're all kind of sharing this one planet and that the interactions between people and animals and the environment can either be negative or positive, and these are engagements that can go either way. And so for the most part, we have to address problems in a transdisciplinary way. It's particularly important in my area of expertise because if we're working related to wildlife management or conservation, clearly we have to deal with people and we have to deal with the issues that are affecting the environment as well. And so this is a concept that we're really trying to bring across to all of our students at DelVal. And we try to introduce this through three different measures. One is education. So we have individual courses that actually engage in the One Health concept right from the first year of coming to DelVal. And we've just introduced a new One Health transdisciplinary degree as well. Research, trying to encourage people to work across disciplines. And then finally, outreach. And that's what this seminar is all about. So the One Health seminar series, we have 6 seminars every semester. And we are hoping to engage not only our students, but the people in our community as well. I know this is pretty quick, but if you'd like to learn more about One Health, or you'd like to see some of our past seminars, or even this one later on, just go to www.delval.edu/One Health, one word. And now we've got a co-sponsor this evening. And so Marissa Jacobs from the Bucks County Audubon Society is going to tell us a little bit about what they're up to.
Thanks, Reg. So at the Bucks County Audubon Society, we are passionate about engaging the public and educating mainly kids, but we do some adult education as well. So this One Health series really rings true with our mission of engaging and trying to have that outreach aspect. We are a conservation-minded organization that focuses on environmental education. You could go to the next slide. We have a bunch of upcoming events. You all might be really interested in our sustainability lunch and learn series. It's all virtual through Zoom, just like this is, and it takes place at 12 p.m. on Wednesdays weekly. And this series, we just finished up one about nature in your backyard, where you could identify different wildlife, plant, and fungi. And now this one is all focused on sustainability. What is it, and what are some ways that we can go green in some sort of way? It starts on October 28th is the first one in this series, and it will continue a break for Thanksgiving and then continue back up in December, as you can see here. We also have other public programs. We have a Bio Blitz going on right now that would be great if everyone could come out. It's going on for this entire week. And any of our events or registering can be found at www.bcas.org, and you can go to our events calendar from there and learn more about what we do and how we like to work with people like DelVal and Grant Sizemore on projects like this.
Thank you, Marissa. And I didn't note this, but Marissa is also a DelVal alum. So good to have you with us.
Thanks.
And so now I'd like to introduce our speaker. This is Grant Sizemore, and Grant's going to be getting his presentation up here. Grant is the director for invasive species programs at the American Bird Conservancy. I'm very fortunate that I actually have the great fortune to work with Grant on One Health Task Force for Pennsylvania. And I've been very excited about having him speak today. Welcome, Grant.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the introduction and the opportunity to be here. So as Reg said, my name is Grant Sizemore. I'm the Director of Invasive Species Programs for American Bird Conservancy. And we're going to talk about domestic cats today, and in particular, domestic cats and One Health, what you need to know. So Reg has already kind of gone into One Health a little bit, and I imagine that most people participating today as a part of a One Health seminar series really already understood what One Health was to begin with, but just to go over that information one more time, it is the notion that human, animal, and environmental health are interconnected. And One Health really supports working collaboratively. It's a big part of what One Health is across multiple disciplines and scales, because these types of partnerships can help to achieve optimal health for people, animals, and the environment. And the World Health Organization's description of One Health specifically includes programs, policies, legislation, and research. And I think these recognitions are particularly important for what we're going to be discussing today, and I'll come back to these a little bit later in the talk. So One Health is incredibly relevant now and really always, but unless you've been living under a rock for the last 7 months, you're aware of what's going on with the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic, the pathogen that causes COVID-19. And so this slide is really just to show the interaction between people, between animals, the environment, and how all of that can lead to positive or negative outcomes, as Reg alluded to in the introduction. So in their article published September 30th, Deem and Brent White argued that One Health is, quote, imperative to get through this pandemic and prevent future ones. So before we get too far into the presentation, I think it's usually a good idea to kind of introduce who the source is, and that would be me in this case. So what is American Bird Conservancy? What do we do? So American Bird Conservancy is a 501c3 nonprofit organization that's dedicated to the conservation of native birds and their habitats throughout the Americas. ABC's bird conservation work involves protecting habitats throughout the Americas, stewarding those habitats, engaging with private landowners to facilitate bird-friendly practices, and advocating science-based conservation policies. And that's where my work falls within the organization. I'm in the policy division, which really focuses on addressing human-caused threats like building collisions and pesticides to help advance bird conservation. And as part of the invasive species programs that we have, I run our Cats Indoors program. And just full disclosure here, as I'm talking about cats throughout this talk, it's all coming from a place of love. This is my cat, Amelia Bedelia. And you can see my pre-pandemic look here. But I also want to talk about cat terminology because when discussing cats, frequently different words and terms get thrown around, and anyway, it can get confusing. So for the purposes of this talk, I want to make sure we're all on the same page. So domestic cat will refer to the species Felis catus, and then some separation based on lifestyle. So free-ranging cat is any domestic cat that roams outdoors without restriction, and this is synonymous with free-roaming cat and at-large cat. And then a stray cat specifically refers to a free-ranging cat that is habituated to people, whereas a feral cat, on the other hand, is a free-ranging cat that is not habituated to people. Okay, so domestic cats were first domesticated about 10,000 years ago from the Near Eastern wildcat, which roamed North Africa and the Middle East, which you can see in this image here is in that kind of orange color. But since domestication and owing to its close affiliation with people, the domestic cat has been introduced to new environments across the globe. So this image is from Medina et al. 2011, and it really illustrates the worldwide distribution of domestic cats. This one happens to be focusing on islands, but domestic cats are on every single continent in the world except Antarctica at this point. And the introduction of this non-native predator, as you might expect, has resulted in some pretty serious problems for native wildlife. A 2016 study found that domestic cats have contributed to the extinction of 63 species in the wild. This accounts for 26% of all extinctions from invasive mammalian predators. Now, the most famous example probably comes from New Zealand, where a lighthouse keeper's pet cat almost simultaneously discovered a new species. That's the Stevens Island wren here on the bottom right, and eradicated it within a few years. So the Stevens Island wren is now extinct, and it's a result of this lighthouse keeper's cat, presumably named Tibbles, that's what the accounts say, finding it, collecting it in its mouth, bringing it back to the lighthouse keeper, who then sent it off for analysis, discovered it was a new species, previously unknown, and then within a couple of years, they were all extinct. So at this point, the IUCN, or International Union for Conservation of Nature, lists domestic cats as among the world's most harmful invasive species. Even when domestic cats are not causing species extinctions, their predatory impacts on wildlife are pretty enormous. In countries across the world, estimates indicate that domestic cats kill hundreds of millions to billions of different types of wildlife every year. And here in the US, where domestic cats are estimated 2.4 billion birds every year, domestic cats are the single greatest direct source of human-caused bird mortality, far surpassing window collisions, power lines, pesticides, etc. And these losses matter. Birds are in steep decline in this country. In the last 50 years, the United States and Canada have experienced a net loss of 2.9 billion birds, and 1/3 of all North American bird species are in need of urgent conservation action. So unfortunately, even well-fed domestic cats will hunt and kill wildlife. These images on the left are from a 2014 study, which was conducted in partnership between the University of Georgia and National Geographic. They used these small collar-mounted video cameras, which they called kitty cams, to monitor the outdoor behaviors of owned and well-fed free-ranging cats. So these cats still killed wildlife. And actually what was really interesting in the study was that not so much that they killed wildlife, but the magnitude of wildlife that they killed. So the videos and the data collected in those videos indicated that free-ranging cats actually only returned about 1 in 4 prey back to the home. So this suggested a major underestimate by pet owners of the total numbers of animals killed by their pets. And such predation can lead to local extinctions, which is called extirpation. So for example, Crooks and Soule recorded the absence of certain types of birds when free-ranging cats were present. That's this image on the top right. Interestingly, when coyotes were present in the system, cats were not present, and those same birds were present in the environment. So this level of predation can affect the abundance of certain species and modify the functioning of ecosystems and the dynamics of the animals within those systems. The presence of free-ranging cats in one study in California was shown to increase the number of non-native rodents and actually decrease the number of native rodents. Furthermore, domestic cats don't actually need to kill their prey to impact them. In addition to animals that are attacked but never outright killed, the mere presence of a domestic cat in the environment has been shown to affect bird reproductive success. That's this Fearing the Feline study that's in the middle of the slide. Using a prop domestic cat, so like a stuffed cat, researchers observed a decrease in the amount of food given to young and an increase in nest mortality. Okay, so thus far, I've been talking about the impacts of free-ranging cats as predators. And I want to kind of lead with this because it's a topic that sometimes gets overlooked when thinking about One Health. But the health of the environment and clearly of the animals in that environment are dependent upon healthy ecosystems, including healthy populations of wildlife. So when non-native predators like domestic cats are introduced, they disrupt these ecosystems and certainly contribute to poorer health for wildlife. But this loss of biodiversity is also an important component of One Health. But for now, we're going to move on into areas that are probably more traditionally thought of as One Health, and that's zoonotic diseases. So this table, which was published in a 2015 study, and hopefully you can see that citation there on the bottom left. I hope it's not cut off. But this table lists many of the various parasites and diseases of concern with regard to domestic cats. As you can see, there are quite a few. And I'm not going to talk about all of these today. And not all of them are necessarily a big concern where you live. Plague, for example, is more a concern in the Western United States than in the Eastern United States. But for the purposes of our discussion today, I'm going to focus on two of these pathogens, and that's rabies and toxoplasmosis. So rabies is a viral zoonosis caused by infection with a virus of the genus Lysovirus. An estimated 59,000 people die of rabies around the world every year. And as most people know, once symptoms arise, death is pretty much assured. There are a handful of rabies virus variants in the US, which are illustrated here in the map. Skunk, fox, mongoose, raccoon. Pennsylvania is in the part of the country with the raccoon virus variant. It's hard to say quickly. The number of human rabies cases in the US has been drastically reduced in recent decades. And this is due in large part to the eradication of the canine rabies virus variant and better dog control laws. Today, though, and for decades now, really, domestic cats are the top source of rabies among domestic animals, consistently outpacing rabid dogs by about 4-to-1. And these cases are primarily focused in the eastern United States, while a larger number of wildlife are absolutely confirmed rabid every year. Domestic cats disproportionately expose people to the virus. And this is because people are far more likely to try and pet an unknown domestic cat as opposed to a raccoon or a skunk. Consequently, an estimated 16% of all administered rabies post-exposure prophylaxis in the United States is due to domestic cat exposure. But even if you aren't likely to try to pet a domestic cat of unknown vaccination history, really, which you should not do, you could still be at risk. And here's a video from a nearby state that indicates this level of risk.
We're not hearing the audio, Grant.
Are you not? Oh, dear. Okay. Well, let's see what I can do here. Does that help at all, Reg?
Yeah, that's a little bit better. Still not very loud, but a little bit better.
All right, I'll just summarize it at the end.
warning. A rabid cat attacked several people who were now at risk. The cat was not acting normally. It was attacking people. It was jumping at the window. It had a broken leg and was not nursing the broken leg that much.
It jumped right here, jumped right here on the side.
Charles Mason says the black and white cat attacked a customer last Monday as he tried to leave Mason's convenience store. His surveillance cameras caught it on video.
It came to the door. As soon as the customer opened the door, it jumped on him and it bit him or scratched him because he knocked him off, knocked him down.
That man got treatment, but health officials say the cat roamed near the Family Dollar on Campus Stella for days, scratching and jumping on several people. Now the health department is trying to find them.
These people are not coming forward because I think that they think the same thing you think, that, oh, once symptoms start, I'll just go to the doctor. Not with this.
If not treated in 30 days, rabies is fatal. And once symptoms start, Engel says it's too late. Now they're going door to door, visiting soup kitchens, even using this electronic sign, hoping to help people before it's too late.
Call us and we will work out transportation. We'll work out whatever we have to do to get them in there for the series of 4. We will work with them. We need them to come in so we don't lose them.
Okay, so I apologize for the sound issues there. If you didn't catch it, basically a rabid cat was found in the community. There was video evidence of the cat just stalking people outside of a convenience store and attacking them as soon as they came outside. And it emphasized the level of concern that the local health department had for people that may have been exposed to that particular rabid cat. So Pennsylvania was 3rd in total number of rabid animals in the United States in 2018, behind Texas and Virginia. But it was number 1 in terms of rabid domestic cats. And rabid domestic cats have outpaced all other rabid domestic animals for years. Between 2001 and 2018, domestic cats accounted for 86% of all rabid domestic animals in Pennsylvania. 86%. And these cases continue to spread westward across the state. A good review of the rabies risk among domestic cats in Pennsylvania was published in 2014 by Campagnolo et al. And the author stated that as over 86% of rabid cats are associated with human exposure, and that was between 1982 and 2011, and 29% of all animals with human exposure are rabid cats, the burden this problem places on public health, government animal health authorities, animal caregivers, and contacts is significant. So, rabies management. The National Association of State Public Health Veterinarians is the organization tasked with public health procedures involving zoonotic diseases in the US. And this organization puts out what's called the Compendium of Animal Rabies Prevention and Control. It's really the best management practices guidelines for addressing rabies risks in the community. And this compendium states that all domestic cats, domestic dogs, and pet ferrets, of which maybe there are quite a few, I wasn't aware, but must be given an initial rabies shot, followed by a booster after 1 year, and then given boosters at regular intervals in line with vaccine manufacturer recommendations. And so those are typically 1 or 3 years. Now, furthermore, the National Association of State Public Health Veterinarians states that, quote, stray dogs, cats, and ferrets should be removed from the community. Outdoor feeding of domestic cats is one of those things that should also be restricted, as it increases the likelihood of interaction with rabies vector wildlife like raccoons because of congregating at a food source. And owned domestic cats should be kept under their owner's control. Now, despite 23 confirmed cases of rabies in domestic cats in Pennsylvania in the first 6 months of 2020, as well as a history of rabid domestic cats in the state state currently only requires vaccination of domestic cats that spend, quote, part or all of a 24-hour day in a residence inhabited by a human being. So any barn cats, for example, or this would be a group of domestic cats at really a high risk because they'd be interacting with rabies virus carriers. These cats are not subject to this requirement. Okay, we're going to change gears here a little bit and move on from rabies and talk about one of my favorite fascinating parasites, pathogens, Toxoplasma gondii. So Toxoplasma gondii, or I'm going to say toxo probably for short, is an apicomplexan parasite that causes toxoplasmosis. And it can infect any warm-blooded species, but it relies on felines to complete its life cycle. The parasite can only sexually reproduce in the gut of a feline. Now, until, excuse me, until last year, the mechanism of this host specificity was unclear, but new research, which was done in this image on the left, indicated that a lack of the enzyme delta-6 desaturase in felines and the subsequent buildup of linoleic acid is what allows for the successful reproduction of this parasite in felines. So the parasite sexually reproduces in the gut of a domestic cat and is then excreted into the environment via feces in the form of oocysts, which are like tiny capsules of parasite, kind of like eggs. Here, the parasite can remain in the environment and remain infectious for months to years, whether that be in soil, fresh water, or salt water, or on plant material. And a single cat can excrete hundreds of millions of these oocysts. And then any warm-blooded species, so any bird, any mammal, that then accidentally ingests or inhales the parasite can become infected. Once in this intermediate host, the parasite asexually reproduces in the host tissues, especially muscles and the central nervous system. Now, this intermediate host can be consumed by another warm-blooded species and pass the parasite along, or it might be consumed by a feline, which is a definitive host, where the parasite once again completes its life cycle and begins sexual reproduction anew. So one of the most fascinating things about this parasite is its ability to increase its chances of making it from an intermediate host back to a definitive host. And it does this through host manipulation. In their seminal work on the subject, Bird et al. Published a study in 2000, which observed that rodents infected with toxo spent more time in areas with cats, or in this case, it was with cat scent, than they spent in areas without cat scent. That relationship was flipped for their non-infected counterparts. So rodents with toxo spent more time in areas where cats were present, and those without the infection spent less time where cats were present. And they concluded that, quote, manipulation by Toxoplasma gondii appears to alter subtly the cognitive perception of the host in the face of predation risk. So by modifying the host's risk perceptions, an otherwise wary rodent became an easier target for predation, thus increasing the chance that the parasite can complete its life cycle. I think that's really cool. It's a little zombie parasite. Now, seeing as how toxo can infect all warm-blooded species, many domestic animals are also at risk. Domestic cats are a definitive host and clearly play a major role in the transmission of the parasite, but they actually do not show any symptoms of infection typically. Domestic dogs, horses, cows, and chickens similarly do not typically show clinical toxoplasmosis, but they are still infected and could pass along the parasite through tissue consumption. A recent study by Chalkowski et al. Observed that 40% of free-ranging chickens on Kauai tested positive for infection. So they still definitely do get the parasite. Pigs, goats, and sheep are particularly susceptible. In sheep, congenital infection, that's infection in the womb, is a leading cause of stillbirth and preterm lamb loss. And the disease is more severe in goats, especially in adults as opposed to adult sheep. Pigs are also particularly susceptible, and as omnivores, they can pick it up congenitally, so in the womb, or through the consumption of contaminated plants or infected animals. Non-confinement livestock housing in facilities lacking adequate biosecurity and pest management practices represent a significant risk factor for livestock infection. And this is pretty relevant and significant for human health because toxoplasmosis is the second leading cause of death among foodborne illnesses in the United States. And so, of course, limiting infection in food animals would be key to managing that risk. Now, wildlife are also at risk of infection with Toxoplasma gondii, and infections in wildlife, whether lethal or sublethal, can affect a wide variety of species, again, all warm-blooded species. I should also note that wild felids like bobcats can also serve as a definitive host of the parasite and excrete oocysts in their feces. As a contributor to the environmental contamination, however, the scale of domestic cats on the landscape far surpasses the numbers of native felids. In addition to carnivores and omnivores that may be infected by eating other infected animals, herbivores are also at risk of Toxoplasma gondii infection. A study of white-tailed deer in northern Ohio found that nearly 60% of all deer had been exposed to the parasite, and the exposure rate increased with age, which is indicative of environmental exposure as opposed to congenital exposure. Now, freshwater and marine species may also be exposed. The southern sea otter off the coast of California has been heavily studied as a result of mortalities due to toxo exposure. And this was determined to be coming from the environment, the terrestrial environment, where oocysts deposited into the environment were flowing through the watersheds and being deposited into the nearshore environment. And like with deer in Ohio, the exposure prevalence for southern sea otters increased with increasing age, again, indicative of that environmental contamination pathway. Now, mounting deaths of Hawaiian monk seals, which are also an endangered species. So southern sea otters are a threatened species, monk seals are an endangered species, are causing some serious concern for conservationists in Hawaii. Many of the monk seals are washing up on shore, are being determined to have been exposed to toxo and having succumbed to their wounds, their infections. So these infections, many of which can be tied back directly to domestic cats. In the white-tailed deer example, the authors concluded that urban and suburban cats, cat densities were the most likely reason for increased exposure to Toxoplasma gondii. And in Hawaii, domestic cats are the only feline present. So if there's toxo in the environment, it's coming from domestic cats. So now let's talk a little bit about human infection and the consequences of that. As you might have guessed, we're no different. We're a warm-blooded species. So we also are subject to exposure risks and subsequent infection by Toxoplasma gondii. And toxoplasmosis in people can be either acute or chronic and can manifest in a wide range of ways, including those presented in this table on the top right. So in the US, an estimated 1.1 million people are infected with toxo every year. And over 1 in 10 people show signs of past exposure through a measure of seroprevalence. So most people, when they've even heard of toxoplasmosis, have heard of it in the context of pregnancy. A physician will say, don't change a cat's litter box when you're pregnant. And this is good advice because infection during pregnancy can cause miscarriages, fetal deformities, premature birth, or involve symptoms in the brain or eyes. And infants can become deaf later in life. So clearly not something you want to get. Retinal toxoplasmosis is another manifestation of infection. About 5,000 people in the US develop ocular toxoplasmosis every year. And whereas pregnant women were initially thought to be the only group at risk, then new research indicated that immunocompromised individuals were at risk. The latest research actually indicates that even previously believed benign infections may be problematic, and otherwise healthy adults could potentially suffer severe consequences of infection. As I mentioned earlier, toxoplasmosis is the second leading cause of death from foodborne illness in the United States. And undercooked meat is a very important infection pathway. An estimate of exposure risk from encountering infected pork in the United States was relatively low in any given year, just a little over 6% for the entire country, 14% for the Northeast. But when you aggregate that over a 10-year period, the exposure likelihood jumps significantly to 47, almost 48% for the US and 78% in the Northeastern United States. Nevertheless, the environmental exposure pathway, which is caused by infection with oocysts that are excreted by felids, is likely more important. A 2011 study by Boyer et al. Found that 78% of all congenital toxoplasmosis cases in 4 epidemics in North America originated from oocyst exposure. And a study among 3 communities in California estimated that 40.2 grams of feces were deposited per domestic cat per day, which amounted to 76 tons of feces annually. So this is not only a waste removal problem, but it presents a lot of opportunities for the transmission of Toxoplasma gondii oocysts into the environment. Okay, so we've reviewed some of the One Health risks associated with domestic cats, including direct and indirect impacts to biodiversity and environmental health, and risks associated with the spread of parasites and diseases. At this point, you might be wondering, well, okay, what do we do about it? And maybe you've noticed a common thing, a theme among these risks, and that's free-ranging domestic cats. So to truly minimize the One Health risks associated with domestic cats, we have to incentivize and enforce responsible pet ownership. This means caring for the health and welfare of domestic cats, but also considering the impacts that our pet cats have on the human and animal communities around us. In the United States, we do a pretty good job with domestic dogs, which are usually under an owner's control, required to be immunized against rabies. They wear identification. It's time to treat domestic cats like we treat domestic dogs, responsibly. So by keeping domestic cats indoors, whether that's in a house or on a leash or in a catio, under an owner's control, we not only prevent harmful interactions with people, other domestic animals, or wildlife, we also significantly reduce the risks of our pets' infection with parasites, which this Chalkowski et al. Study found was 3 times more likely for outdoor domestic cats. And by the way, keeping domestic cats under an owner's control is also one of the key recommendations of the American Veterinary Medical Association, along with identification like microchipping, preventative medicine, enrichment, and sterilization. And for stray and feral cats, policies and enforcement should prioritize the removal of these animals from the environment. Continuing to permit stray and feral cats to roam outdoors, whether sterilized or not, facilitates ongoing One Health risks. Now, under existing Pennsylvania regulations, domestic cats that spend all or part of a 24-hour day inside a house where a person lives, this is really specific, are required to be vaccinated for rabies by the age of 3 months. This limitation is because the Department of Agriculture is only authorized to regulate domestic animals in captivity. But what about stray and feral cats or domestic cats that remain on a person's property but don't come in the house? These gaps need to be filled to protect cats and communities from rabies risks. And Aguirre et al. In 2019 similarly acknowledged the need for effective management policies that reduce environmental transmission risks of Toxoplasma gondii. They noted that the policies that remove domestic cats from the environment help reduce these risks, but policies that maintain domestic cats roaming the landscape are counterproductive. So this is where that acknowledgement of programs, policies, legislation, and research come into play for One Health risk mitigation. American Bird Conservancy has put together model ordinance language to help facilitate these changes for the better. And that's here on the right side of your screen. Key components of this model ordinance include sterilization, licensing, vaccination, and containment. There are also some signs of hope. The Broward County Zoo is promoting catios as a means of education and adoption for a local animal shelter. Research is ongoing on the One Health risks and solutions regarding domestic cats, and new resources continue to be developed, like these on the right from American Bird Conservancy, to help foster informed decision-making, not only for pet owners, but also for public policymakers and public health officials. So I hope you will join this movement. There are a variety of ways that you can get involved through American Bird Conservancy's website. We have a newsletter, a pledge to keep cats contained, lots of information on solutions for own cats to even provide them some responsible outdoor time, like on a leash or in a stroller or in a catio. This is a movement for One Health, and it's going to take interested people like you and me to model this behavior, to enact the social change that will be necessary to really reduce the One Health risks. So, in review, domestic cats are a One Health risk when they are allowed to roam the environment, when they are free ranging or free roaming or at large. Removing cats from the landscape minimizes biodiversity loss and rabies and Toxoplasma gondii exposure risks, and really benefits One Health. And finally, we need your voice to be involved, to support responsible pet ownership in your communities, both at the local level, at the state level, to model the types of behavior that we need to see enacted, and to be that voice for science-based public policies in your communities. So with that, I will end my presentation, and I would be happy to take any questions that you might have.
Yeah, we invite people to place their questions in the Q&A section at the bottom. I think we have a couple of questions there, Grant, if you want to take a look at those, and there's some more coming on here as well. First one was, can cats become infected by Toxoplasma gondii?
So yeah, that's a good question. They host Toxoplasma gondii, the parasite, and then so they are infected with it. It's not a normal part of their system, but they don't typically show signs of clinical toxoplasmosis. So you can host Toxoplasma gondii, the parasite, but not necessarily have the disease toxoplasmosis.
And we have another question here from Darius Lopez. Being a cat lover and fostering 20 plus cats in the past 2 to 3 years, I've read into a lot about them and toxoplasmosis, and at some point read that there is a positive connection between motorcycle crashes and the victims testing positive for toxo. Do you have any information on how the brain is affected that would make it synonymous with motorcycle crashes?
Yeah, cool question, Darius. Right, there has been evidence to show an increase in association with motorcycle crashes and Toxoplasma gondii infection rates. And it's thought that the infection of toxo might increase risk-prone behaviors, at least among males. And so one of the studies that I presented in the slides was by Tori and Yolkin. It was published in 2013, and it was, gosh, I forget the name of it. Anyway, it's how cats are making us crazy, essentially. A public health concern regarding toxoplasma and its impacts on neurodegenerative diseases, mental health. And so there are some interesting corollaries there. It's not so clear that it's what the cause or effect really are in that relationship. But with like schizophrenia, which was mentioned, there is stronger evidence for an association. Again, not clear if you have toxo and then get schizophrenia, or it's got schizophrenia and then get toxo. But there does appear to be an association. And that's part of the reason is because of the location in the body, or locations in the body, where Toxoplasma gondii encysts. So it creates these tissue cysts in muscle tissues, but also in the central nervous system and in the brain. And so when you get these small cysts in the brain, they subtly impact some of the functioning within the brain. It's thought that there might be, we're starting to get a little bit outside of my element with the neurochemistry here, but it's dopamine, I believe, is impacted partly by the infection with toxo inside the brain. And so it modifies the host's behavior. So this would be not really necessarily intended to work this way in people, but it's an artifact of the way toxo modifies its host to increase the likelihood of consumption by a feline and increase the likelihood that it can complete its life cycle.
As also being a cat lover, I'm convinced that my cats completely control my life.
Yeah, you and me both.
So we have another question from Claire. Do you feel that TNR is effective or no?
Well, Claire, it depends on what your definition of effective is. My definition would be reliable reduction in the numbers of domestic cats roaming the environment. So this primarily targets stray and feral cats. And to also be effective, it must reduce risks associated with One Health. So impacts to life through predation or disease risks. And using that standard, TNR is not effective. And for those who don't know, TNR is trap, neuter, release, or trap, neuter, return, or sometimes called trap, neuter, reabandon, where domestic cats that are typically unowned in the environment are trapped, taken to a facility where they're sterilized, and then immediately released back into the environment. And they may or may not have some kind of care associated with that, like feeding. But in my opinion, and based on the science that's been published to date, TNR is overwhelmingly not effective because it does not reliably reduce domestic cat populations. And by putting these cats back into the environment, it facilitates the ongoing harms that are experienced with regard to predation on wildlife and disease transmission risks. Far better to just remove the cats from the environment.
We have a related question from Meg. Would you be against TNR because although they are fixed, they are still free to roam and kill wildlife? What would be the best solution for feral cats?
Yeah, so I kind of answered that already. I am opposed to TNR as a public policy because it's been shown to not reduce cat populations and maintains those risks associated with cats in the environment. So for feral cats, we at American Bird Conservancy advocate for treating them like we treat feral dogs. We don't do TNR for dogs. We don't do TNR for other invasive species. We remove them. And that's exactly the policy that we promote at American Bird Conservancy. And that removal can take a variety of different, types. It could be placement in an animal shelter or adoption or a long home in a cat sanctuary, or if all other potential alternatives are exhausted, then it might mean euthanasia. But under no circumstances should these animals be permitted to just roam free in the environment.
All right, we have a question from Robert. Did the domestic cats get all over the world by the actions of people?
Yes, so domestic cats had a very close association with people. Of course, that's how they became domesticated, and they were deliberately transferred across the globe by people. They had a prominent role on many ships for rodent control. And then once the ship docks, cats and rodents and many other things were deposited into the new environment and unfortunately impacted those ecosystems often in negative ways.
Sydney asks, do declawed cats still pose the same risk?
You know, that's a good question, Sydney. I don't know. I don't have any data to say one way or the other. I would say the risk may be reduced somewhat, but and I guess it depends on what risk we're talking about here. But from a predation standpoint, the risk would be reduced a little bit, but probably not eliminated. Cats are perfectly capable of killing wildlife or certainly transmitting diseases with or without their claws.
Zoe asks, rabies vaccines are incredibly expensive, too expensive for most people to afford. Is anybody trying to make it more accessible to the general public? I'm not sure if Zoe's talking about prophylaxis for humans. If I'm correct, I don't think vaccines for the cats are that expensive.
Yeah, I don't think they're that expensive. It depends probably on where you're getting it done. You know, a private veterinarian might mark up on a vaccine because, you know, it's a business. The post-exposure prophylaxis for people is typically covered by the local public health department when there's been an exposure. And I know some of these costs can really skyrocket quickly. There was a case I read about in, I don't remember which state, it wasn't Pennsylvania, but it was a single stray kitten was picked up and passed around at a softball game. And it turned out that kitten was rabid. And so everybody who handled it had to get post-exposure prophylaxis. And it was a lot of people. And it turned out to cost over $1 million for the local community to actually provide that post-exposure prophylaxis and prevent any potential deaths as a result of that exposure.
Oh, we just got in the comment section, we were just told by Dennis that the annual cat rabies shot is about $30. Thank you, Dennis. Okay. Let me see here. So Tim, I live on a farm and we have a number of barn cats that we cannot catch and we do not have the money to sterilize. We haven't had any issues with our livestock and I haven't noticed any dead birds besides starlings. The barn swallows seem to know how to avoid them. Should we do anything about our barn cats?
Well, I think, Tim, you probably know my answer. Yes, you should. So they absolutely need to be sterilized. Otherwise, you are continuing to contribute to the local cat population. But sterilized or not, barn cats or they're just free ranging cats. They're going to still kill wildlife. They're eating something, right? I mean, even if you feed them, they tend to kill wildlife, which is what was shown in that kitty cam study that I talked about earlier. And then they're also a disease risk. So you may not have, let's see, you said you haven't had any issues that you're aware of in livestock. Yeah, so things like, you would notice rabies because the animal would die right away. Things like Toxoplasma, gondii, you might not notice, especially with those livestock that don't readily show clinical toxoplasmosis. But that doesn't mean that they're not being affected. So you might have a miscarriage or a stillbirth, or it could just reduce the overall health of that individual animal. And you might not attribute it to Toxoplasma gondii, but that might be the case. And and as far as the starlings, barn swallows, I mean, cats are a bomb when it comes to wildlife depredations. They don't target the species we want them to target. They are optimistic predators and will kill a wide variety of wildlife. So if you're interested in rodent control, there are native predators. There are other means of reducing rodents in the barn or around the barn, whatever the case may be. Cats really aren't a great way of doing that. I should add, one study found when looking at rats in particular, that when cats were present, the rats didn't go away. They just weren't necessarily as visible.
From Casey, we have, besides keeping cats indoors, are there any other ways to limit widespread exposure and infection of toxo, like a vaccine or parasite preventative?
There is no vaccine. There's a vaccine for sheep, I believe, and I think at one time there was a vaccine for cats, but it was too expensive and not. For some reason, it got shelved. So for all intents and purposes, no, there's no vaccine. There's no vaccine for people. The best way to reduce exposure risk is to keep cats inside, but also to feed cats a well-cooked meal. So if you're feeding them like chicken or beef or something, just make sure you cook it all the way through so that any parasites that might be in that meat are killed. And that same goes for you, by the way. You could be exposed in the same pathway. But also not letting them go outside to eat wildlife where the cycle can continue. I guess those are really the best ways to prevent it. If you have concerns, for example, make sure you're regularly taking care of the litter box. It takes a day or two or three or four for the oocysts to, it's called sporulate, become infectious. So if you're cleaning the litter box regularly, then it shouldn't be a big problem. So keeping your cat indoors, cleaning the litter box regularly, feeding it a processed or well-cooked diet, all of these things are great ways to reduce the toxo risk.
We have piles of questions, but we're running out of time. So I'm just going to give you a couple of more here. Claire says, my sister has a cat that enjoys her backyard, but goes no further. She has a small fenced-in yard and the cat does not wander and the cat doesn't hunt. So is she and her cat still at risk for toxo if the cat is able to interact with the ground?
Yeah, good question, Claire. Your cat is, if it's not hunting, it's possible it could still get it from the environment. For example, if another cat has been in the backyard and defecated, it may have introduced toxo to the local environment. And the cat might bring it in, or a person could bring it in, a dog could bring it in if it rolls around. So when you're gardening, you want to wear gloves, wash your hands. if you have a sandbox, you want to keep it covered at all times so that cats can't use it as a latrine. But going out, I'd say the risk is fairly low, as long as the cat remains supervised.
And our last question here is from Anonymous. I work for a cat and kitten shelter, and I also volunteer at a cat and kitten spay and neuter clinic. We use the TNR procedure at both places and given vaccinations and general care to all. Do you have any ideas for how to promote getting cats fixed and to convince others not to let their cats outside? Many people can be extremely stubborn, and serious problems as such are not respected. Other than TNR, what other ideas do you have to control the population?
Yeah, so thank you, Anonymous. um, I don't feel that TNR is an appropriate response for stray and feral cat control. But there are plenty of ways to get people to learn about and incentivize sterilization, vaccination, responsible pet ownership. And we have a lot of those available on our website. That's abcbirds.org/cats. But these things also, there needs to be an education component. You have to create the social norms where it becomes sort of shameful not to do this, not to abide by these responsible pet ownership practices. And then you also should probably put in place legal incentives. So enacting these things in ordinance, like I provided earlier, to enforce, to provide a mechanism for enforcement for those who are not being responsible owners to partake in the behaviors that are going to benefit not only their pets, but also the community around them.
Thank you, Grant. And am I correct that on the site, abcbirds.org, you also have some potential model legislation that might go to your own community?
We do. Yeah, that was the document I showed on one of the slides. Includes sterilization, vaccination, identification, and keeping cats under their owner's control. It's really just treating cats like we already do dogs. And so we have that model ordinance available, as well as a place where you can take action and automatically send that model ordinance to your local legislators and promote the idea of responsible cat ownership in your community.
I think I can speak for all of us that are on this presentation today. We all love cats. I think that's why we're here listening to you today, Grant. And I hope that you've all learned something from this. I think another point that we might make is cats outdoors is also a welfare issue for the cats themselves, I would say.
It is.
Thank you very much, Grant, and thank you all for joining us today. I hope to see you at our next One Health seminars. We actually have two coming up on November 5th during our One Health week at DelVal. Take care and have a good night, everybody.